Professor Tuddenham, there's a set of minutes I want to look at briefly with you. It's HSOC 001 0549, please, Henry. So this is minutes of a meeting of the Haemophilia Centre Directors, 13th of November 1978. So it's the big meeting, not the reference centre directors meeting. If we go to the fourth page. Sorry, Henry, my apologies. It should have been the third page. We can see just above the present at scientific session only, we've got your name. So you were in attendance at the meeting. And if we go, please, Henry, to page... it's page 12, using the numbered pagination at the top of the page. Excellent, thank you. We can see halfway down, or just over halfway down, there's a heading, Supplies of Factor VIII Concentrates, the DHSS contract and the price of commercial Factor VIII. There's a fairly lengthy discussion, which I don't need to trouble you with the detail, but if we turn on 2 more pages, please, Henry. We can see, picking up upon the point we saw being made by Dr. Kernoff in that last set of minutes, here, 4 lines down, Dr. Tuddenham said that the cost of cryoprecipitate to his centre is purchased from Edgware Blood Transfusion Centre and calculated on their assay of the Factor VIII content, worked out at 7.5 pence per unit. The cheapest price for commercial concentrate is close to this figure and occasionally below it. So that's your observation. And then Dr. Wensley, I think it was Manchester, on the other hand, estimated that the cost of making cryoprecipitate was about 1/3 of the cost of making concentrates. Was cryoprecipitate an actual hard financial cost to the Royal Free? That's what the minutes seem to be suggesting.
Indeed. Otherwise, I wonder why I would have bothered to work it out. I think it must have been priced per unit, and we were used to paying for blood product. Pro rata, plasma, fresh frozen plasma, platelets. That's certainly what that implies.
And there seems to be a very stark difference there between the cost that you're experiencing from Edgware Blood Transfusion Centre and what Dr. Wensley is describing. Do you know what... Sorry, carry on.
Yes, I'm just thinking of the cost. You've got to buy the plastic where the donors give their precious blood from which the plasma is obtained free, but then you've got to spin it down, put it into a freezing, and then partly thaw it, squeeze off the excess and freeze it again. So it's quite labour intensive. And you've got your staff equipment and so on. So, however, how Dr. Wensley would know the cost of making it, presumably he's a transfusionist who was running a centre.
No, Dr. Wensley was the Haemophilia Centre Director at Manchester Royal Infirmary. Okay,
so he must have talked to the people who were making his cryoprecipitate and worked it out from that.
I'm sorry.
Well, I suppose if that's the case, they were adding on a percentage amount for profit to pay for other. I mean, it was the Edgware Blood Transfusion Centre, of course, is a not-for-profit operation within the healthcare service. And if they chose to make that profit on their cryoprecipitate, that was their commercial decision.
Do you know whether the relative cost of cryoprecipitate was a factor in Dr. Kernoff's decision-making about using commercial concentrates more than cryoprecipitate?
I should think it must have entered into it, yes.
There are some UK HCGO meetings, both reference centre director meetings and the bigger meetings of all directors in the course of 1981, at which a particular issue was discussed on a number of occasions and concern expressed about a proposal to take control of purchasing and supply away from haemophilia centre directors and give that control to regional transfusion centre directors or regional transfusion centres. I can show you the minutes if need be, but do you recall that debate at all?
No.
Well, let me just show you what Dr. Kernoff wrote about it then, rather than asking you about what was said in more general terms in the minutes. If we go to OXUH 0000 886_002, please, Henry. This is a letter from Dr. Kernoff to Professor Bloom, 28th of September 1983. So this picks up on the issue of centralised purchasing 2 years after it was discussed in strong terms by the Haemophilia Centre directors. And we can see Dr. Kernoff saying he's concerned to hear this idea had been floated again. He was very much opposed to it. And in the second paragraph, last sentence, he says he thinks that the proposal should be resisted by Haemophilia Reference Centre directors as vociferously as possible. I just want to, he then encloses a paper, and I just want to ask you about the paper. So if we go to the next page, we can see he sets out a number of concerns. And if we look at just 4 of the points, I think point 4, control of usage, he says responsibility for usage of an expenditure on an essential drug must lie at the point of consumption, i.e. with Haemophilia Centre directors. It will be ethically and legally impossible to restrict usage by imposition of cash and supply limits. So that's one of the points he makes. If we then go to point 6, just a little bit below that, please, Henry. We can see, so this is September 1983, increased concern about AIDS/hepatitis requires central control. His response is to say not so, maximum flexibility and ability to respond quickly to changing circumstances can only be achieved if responsibility for selection of type of material/brand/formulation remains with those who have most intimate knowledge of the subject. And then if we go over the page, under the first paragraph, mechanics of purchasing, he says tendering and contracting must involve very close collaboration between Haemophilia Centre directors, financial/administrative personnel and the companies. And then last point before I ask you about this, if we go down the page, Henry, towards the second half of the page. Thank you. If we see the third paragraph down on the screen, he says, sets out to concern the supply of factor VIII may be restricted. This will be contrary to the interests of patients. Haemophilia Centre directors will not tolerate interference with supply by the BTS because the BTS has no direct responsibility for patient care. Now, it's clear this was a matter that Dr. Kernoff was very concerned about. He wanted, for some of the reasons we see alluded to there, Haemophilia Centre directors such as himself to retain control and be actively involved in purchasing. Is this something that you recall being discussed with Dr. Kernoff as a particular concern at the time?
No, I don't recall that at all. Reading these letters has been quite an eye-opener to me. Nowadays, we do it all centrally, but it's done as a bidding process in which are involved not just haemophilia doctors, but patients and the Department of Health, and subsequently have achieved extremely good pricing, best in the world, actually. I mean, lowest. It's called best, but for product of equal quality, that's become more complicated, of course, since there's many more different advanced products now. But back then, Peter's insistence on local decision, I can see the force of the arguments he uses for it, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. He took care of all that.
And that possibly answers my next question, but I'll ask in any event, Professor Tuddenham. We've seen from other documents, which I won't trouble you with now, Dr. Kernoff being actively involved, consistent with what he says here, with choosing which particular pharmaceutical company or companies will receive the contract for a given year's supply. Did you have any involvement in that, or was that solely the province of Dr. Kernoff?
That was solely his province.
Before I turn to ask you about issues relating to risks of hepatitis and HIV, there's just one further issue about products I wanted to explore with you at this stage. Porcine factor, which we've seen alluded to in some usage of in the annual returns, and was something you were quite closely involved with in the early 1980s.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you to look at one document. I think we've got a range of documents from you, including some published papers on the topic, but we'll just look at one. It's ISPN 40156_101. IPSN, I'm sorry. Let's try that again. Let me just get... Yes, thank you. IPSN 40156_101. Sorry, Henry. So these are some notes of a lecture you gave in Toronto. I've got a note it's 1981, which sounds about right. Do you think that's right? Because the document itself is undated. I think that's put together from the reference to the 1976 World Federation, then after almost 5 years. So it would seem to fit being around 1981.
Yes.
There are two particular issues that you're talking about in this lecture. One is about a fractionation process using polyelectrolytes.
Yep.
And then you talk specifically about porcine factor VIII. Before we come on to the latter, could you just explain briefly, and in terms that those of us who are not scientists will understand, the issue in relation to polyelectrolytes as a new method?
Yes, it's a solid phase process where the polyelectrolyte, whose chemistry is described in the slide, is packed into a column through which fluids can be passed, and the property of the polyelectrolyte surface is that it exposes a certain charge density, and the solutes, that is whatever's dissolved in the fluid you flow over it, be it plasma or cryoprecipitate, they will differentially absorb onto the surface depending on the charge and distribution of charge. And you can then wash, and whatever didn't absorb gets washed off, so you're left with those that are absorbed onto the solid polyelectrolytes, and then you can elute them, wash them off again with a different solution that detaches them progressively, and you can arrange it to detach some before other of whatever's absorbed. So this is a purification step, a solid phase purification step, which turned out to be very attractive for purifying factor VIII and von Willebrand factor, because it had the property that the von Willebrand factor and factor VIII stuck together, but you could take off the factor VIII, leaving the von Willebrand factor behind, and make a very good advance in purification of the factor VIII away from everything else and von Willebrand factor, which is its natural carrier in the blood. And that's very advantageous with pig factor VIII, which, like human factor VIII, and like actually in the blood of all vertebrates down to bony fish, they circulate together, factor VIII and von Willebrand factor. But the pig von Willebrand factor, when you give it to humans, has an undesirable property that it causes platelets, these little particles that plug up wounds, to aggregate in the circulation, and that can be quite dangerous. So purifying pig factor VIII von Willebrand factor complex on these columns delivers you a highly purified pig factor VIII without the undesired pig von Willebrand factor.
And we've seen reference to the polyelectrolyte material in correspondence from Spaywood. Was this work that was being undertaken with your assistance by Spaywood at the time?
I was working with them at the time, and they supplied me. They supplied us with pig factor VIII that we used in I think it was a landmark paper really, treating patients with inhibitors of factor VIII who make antibody to human factor VIII, but less so towards animal factor VIII. And therefore, the animal factor VIII was able to correct the defect, i.e. in a haemophilic blood that you couldn't treat with human factor VIII, you could treat with pig factor VIII. So we had good results with that, and some patients were able to carry on using pig factor VIII for years. Others did make an antibody to the animal factor VIII as well. But it particularly helped me in my research efforts purifying human factor VIII to have as a first step using polyelectrolyte, which Spaywood supplied to me.
And if we go to the last page of this document, please, Henry. First paragraph, you say this: porcine factor VIII is of course used for the treatment of inhibitor patients. Thrombocytopenia has been virtually eliminated as a side effect, and other adverse reactions are much less severe than with previous animal preparations. Haemophilia centres which have used high 8C, so that's the porcine factor VIII product sold by Spaywood, I think, report dramatic improvements in the lifestyle and morale of their inhibitor patients. And then you say this: the possibility of porcine factor VIII-C being used for non-inhibitor patients in countries with a shortfall of human factor VIII should now be seriously considered. Of course, viral hepatitis is not present in porcine plasma, and the product thus presents no risk of infection. And then if we just go to the very bottom of the page, you've talked about various other points, and then you say, we feel a higher purity factor VIII concentrated to yield significantly above the conventional offers excellent prospects for the treatment of haemophilia in the 1980s. Now, turning to back to that first paragraph, we've seen from the annual returns for the Royal Free porcine factor VIII being used in what looks like inhibitor patients only. Was porcine factor VIII ever used more widely in the first part of the 1980s for non-inhibitor patients in the UK?
No, it wasn't. We had in Oxford a whole period in the 1950s when it was used because there weren't supplies of human factor VIII, and but it was only used for short procedures like surgery. So we never did actually transfer over to using pig factor VIII against human. Can I have a short break?
Yes, absolutely. I think a 5-minute break,
yes,
sir.
Would 5 minutes be okay?
5 Thank you.
And Professor Tuddenham, do you know why porcine factor VIII wasn't, following your optimism in 1981, used other than for patients with inhibitors? Was not enough of it made, or were there other concerns?
The concern was that although some of the patients we treated who had inhibitors to factor VIII did not subsequently develop inhibitor to porcine, most of them eventually did. It's still, by the way, used in the rare condition acquired haemophilia, which is an autoimmune condition, mostly in older patients, people who develop, whose immune system goes out of regulation and they start making antibodies to their own factor VIII. Works very well there. And it still can be used in some patients with congenital haemophilia who have antibodies. But in the general case, it's regarded as there's no reason to use it generally in haemophilia A without inhibitors, because we have access to large amounts of recombinant and plasma-derived safe product. At that time, supplies were limited, and I was thinking of it as a cheaper way to provide treatment in low and middle-income countries. And originally, when Macfarlane developed these animal concentrates at Oxford, the reason was that there was very little access to human plasma-derived factor VIII, whereas he could access huge amounts from normal agricultural slaughterhouse sources. And so it was a breakthrough in its day. The further purification made a very useful product. We now have it in a recombinant form, but as a treatment, it never really came in as a general treatment. It could have been used as a way to spare use of, that time, a very risky, dangerous human-derived factor concentrates, but it never was so used.
Wanted to turn then specifically to the risks of human concentrates, and start first of all with hepatitis. You describe in your statement an early experience of learning about hepatitis in 1969. Could you just elaborate upon that? It's paragraph, I think, 24 of your statement, if you need to look back at it.
Yes, my senior registrar, Dr. Brown, had experience with a patient which was written up, and it's in the documents available. It was published in the Lancet. Patient who'd been treated with a fairly large amount of cryoprecipitate, had then developed hepatitis B as became apparent, and he died from it. So I was introduced to the danger of blood transmitted infection at the very first stage when I first came into contact with treating haemophilia.
And then the observation you made in your statement was that non-A, non-B having been detected, you've said it seemed quite mild compared to hepatitis B, without the dreaded fulminant hepatitis that occurs with hepatitis B. What was the basis for the view that hepatitis, non-A, non-B hepatitis was mild at that time?
Just that most patients had a transient, as it seemed then, illness with a modest elevation of the enzymes we use to track inflammation and damage in the liver, the so-called transaminases, and then appeared to get better and had no apparent clinically apparent problems. It was only when we came to follow them up carefully over subsequent months and years that we saw there was ongoing liver damage, and we started to track that using liver biopsy, and you could see the effect of the chronic inflammation in the liver leading to fibrosis and loss of active liver function, eventually leading to liver failure and liver cancer. But at the start, it appeared to be mild compared to hepatitis B, whereas as we saw, can lead to fairly rapidly to death.
And as I understand it, the observations of non-A, non-B being mild was about the acute stage.
Yes.
Comparing the acute stage. But it's also right, and indeed I think Professor Lee referred us to a paper or case report she'd written on it. You could have fulminant hepatitis in non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes, you can, but rarely, I gather. You can also recover from non-A, non-B hepatitis and clear it naturally, which doesn't happen, I think, with hepatitis B.
Do you recall whether you saw at the time that World in Action documentary, December 1975, which looked at the donor pools in the States which were used then to make the concentrates that were being used for haemophiliacs?
In 1975?
Yes.
I didn't see it,
You
no.
didn't see it. In paragraph 26 of your witness statement, you've said that you knew that commercial donation was the norm in US products, but you had no idea of the low standard of screening donors. So the use of paid commercial donations, which resulted in what's sometimes referred to in contemporaneous documents as people from Skid Row, intravenous drug users, and so on, donating blood for money. That was something that you were unaware of.
I didn't know that that was how they obtained their plasma. They certainly didn't admit it or in their literature about what they sourced their product from. We just didn't know.
And so you've said your perception of the type of donor recruited in the US was optimistic, to say the least.
Absolutely. I just assumed that they had standards of similar to what we would apply to people donating plasma in the UK.
I have, with a number of the other clinical witnesses, looked with them at some of the materials from the mid-1970s about non-A, non-B hepatitis. But given that you arrived at the Royal Free in 1978, wondered if we can just look at the state of knowledge in 1978 with you. You described in your statement steps being taken at the Royal Free in terms of liver biopsies. Again, that, I think it's paragraph 24. And you've referred to, so picking it up in 1978 and being at the Royal Free, an awareness of chronic hepatitis, monitoring of the severity of the complication, and then liver biopsies being undertaken with advice from the unit established by Sheila Sherlock, who was at the Royal Free.
Yes.
Until there was, I think, an incident where one particular patient, after a liver biopsy, died. And you go on to say it was clear that the chronic inflammation associated with non-A, non-B hepatitis was causing fibrosis and declining function in some patients. So is it fair to say that whatever your state of knowledge in the earlier part of the 70s might have been, by 1978, you were aware, and your colleague Dr. Kernoff certainly would have been aware, because hepatitis was his particular interest, that non-A, non-B hepatitis was a clinically significant condition with potentially serious long-term consequences?
Yes. Although, as I say, our understanding of the longer-term consequences evolved over time.
Yes. I think rather than take up your time with lots of documents, I'll just ask you to look at one with me because it's something authored by Dr. Kernoff.
Yeah.
Henry, it's BART 0002487. And you'll see this is a letter dated the 27th of April 1979. It's sent by Dr. Kernoff to Dr. Colvin. And we just go to the second page. If you zoom in, Henry, on paragraph 2, types of therapeutic material available, we can see it's about 2/3 of the way through that long paragraph. Dr. Kernoff describes non-A, non-B hepatitis in these terms. This is a serious disease with long-term consequences. And then he goes on to talk about its possible prevalence in different parts of the world. So by 78, 79, although I appreciate entirely Professor Tuddenham, there is still a lot more to learn about non-A, non-B hepatitis. It was understood that it was a serious condition.
Yes.
HIV, I just wanted to ask you about your developing knowledge in relation to AIDS. Again, we've looked in the inquiry at a number of documents in relation to this, so I'm just going to take you to two rather than take you to all of the documents we've explored with others. Henry, could we have PRSE 0002410, please? This is an article that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, January 1983, 13th of January 1983. And it's an article by Jane DeForge. And if we can see it's AIDS and preventative treatment in haemophilia. She talks about cases. So if we go down the page, please, Henry. She talks in the paragraph beginning the risk associated with exposure to plasma from multiple donors, however, has long been a concern in the care of these patients, primarily because of evidence of virus-induced liver disease, and then talks about hepatitis. And then she goes on in the next paragraph to say, now we're becoming aware that treating haemophiliacs with factor VIII preparations may exact a high cost. Reports from the Centres for Disease Control include 3 haemophiliacs amongst cases of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. And then if we just go over to the next page, please, Henry. We can pick it up in the last paragraph of the left-hand column. She says the fact that haemophiliacs are at risk for AIDS is becoming clear. And then if we look at the last sentence of that paragraph, preventing the complications of the present treatment may have to take precedence over preventing the complications of haemophilia itself. Now, first of all, at this time, early 1983, would you expect to have been reading the New England Journal of Medicine as part of keeping up to date?
One would certainly wish to be up to date, and the New England Journal of Medicine is the premier medical journal with the highest impact factor then and now. This particular opinion editorial piece is putting very starkly a balance between which takes precedence, complications of haemophilia or complications of treatment, which would be a hard thing to do when not knowing the prevalence of the feared complication of AIDS. But it's prescient, and it certainly brings to attention that choice.
And can you recall when you first became aware of the reports of an association between haemophiliacs receiving factor concentrates and AIDS?
Oh, as soon as it was reported by the Centre for Disease Control.
So that would have
It
been...
was immediately.
So that would have been, I think, probably July 1982.
Yes.
The second document I wanted to look at with you, Professor Tuddenham, is at PRSE 00002647. These are the notes of a meeting with Immuno at London Airport, 24th of January 1983. It's not a meeting which you're recorded as having attended, but if we go to the last page, please, we can see who was present. So you'll see there a list of names, including the reference centre directors, I think all of them apart from you, and Dr. Kernoff there, presumably representing the Royal Free. And then others, we know that there were representatives of Immuno. We can see Professor Zuckerman was there, and a number of directors of non-reference centres, but of some of the more significant and larger other haemophilia centres. Now, this was a meeting that was discussing the possibility of hepatitis-reduced factor 8 and factor 9 concentrates, discussing the possibility of trials in relation to that. But there's also a discussion about AIDS. So if we just go to the page before this, please, Henry. We can see under the heading Acquired Immunodeficiency Syndrome, it's reported this was discussed in the after-lunch period. Dr. Krask summarised the current position. And then if we go towards the last paragraph on that page, we can see that what the summary includes. 10 haemophiliacs in the US have been affected, 5 have died, the youngest age 7. All cases have had prolonged treatment with factor 8. There's no specific implication of one particular product or batch. Other cases involving blood and blood product transmission have included platelets transfused in 3 cases. And then it gives examples of 2 of those cases. The second, a 20-month-old child who'd received several units, including platelets known to have come from a homosexual donor. The child has developed autoimmune hemolytic anemia and a possible AIDS state. And that's the case referred to in some of the literature subsequently as the San Francisco baby case. And then over the page, we can see, 4th paragraph down, the attention of the meeting being expressly drawn to the New England Journal of Medicine from the 13th of January. Now, I'm conscious this is a meeting that you were not at, Professor Tuddenham, unlike all the reference centre director meetings which you attended. Do you have any recollection of this meeting being raised with you by Dr. Kernoff?
Yeah, we probably didn't have a long discussion about it because I can't recall it. I do recall the T4-T8 ratio being discussed, and implication being that cryoprecipitate either had something that maintained a better ratio and there was something in the concentrates that changed it, but I don't recall a detailed discussion, no.
Professor Lee told us yesterday that, while she didn't know anything about this meeting, that the question of AIDS was something that in 1983 and 1984 was, I'm paraphrasing, not directly quoting, but something that was very much being discussed within the centre.
Yes.
Can you recall any particular discussions, concerns, views being expressed, whether at the multidisciplinary team meetings or otherwise, about AIDS and what the centre's response should be?
We were looking out for it and signs of it in our patients, they were aware that it was entering the haemophilia community as a result of the treatment. The first patients who showed clear signs would have been sometime during 1985, I think, at the Haemophilia Centre.
In the Royal Free?
At the Royal Free in our patient group. There'd been a patient earlier in Bristol, the first UK patient. But we had a young man who died of chickenpox pneumonia, which is obviously highly atypical in an adult. And soon after that, another patient was developing a progressive neurological problems, which ended. And so by the time I left at the end of 1985, we'd actually had two deaths. We also, of course, knew as soon as we tested everyone who was positive. But yeah, we were constantly talking about it.
Am I right in understanding that you attended the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting in Stockholm in 1983?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
And I think we've got a copy of a paper you delivered. I think it was reproduced in the bulletin. So just to see whether I can prompt your memory if I need to, it's PRSE 40411, please. And if we go, this is edition number 2 of 1983. If we go, please, Henry, to page 12. We can see there a talk, innovative alternatives to human factor 8 by you. And if we go to the next page, it says abstract number, this is at the very bottom, abstract number 37 given at the World Federation of Haemophilia, Stockholm, 1983. So is this the text of the talk you gave at that Stockholm meeting?
Yes.
And then if we go back to the previous page, please, Henry. Right-hand column, about a third of the way down. Actually, no, we'll just pick it up in the beginning, because you talk about the process of the preparation of concentrates in very stark terms. You say, let me begin by describing a process for you, one that's very familiar and carried out in all developed countries. A heterogeneous natural product in liquid form derived from many individual citizens is pooled, various substances are added and precipitation occurs, etc., etc. The end product is then widely distributed. Now, what process do you think that might be? Production of factor VIII concentrate. And then if we skip over the picture of you, we can see you say, no, actually, I was describing a sewage treatment plant. The basic principles of sludge separation closely resemble those of fractional precipitation. And then you say, I submit to you that the technology of factor VIII concentrate production has got stuck at a point reached by about 1970. You then go on to talk about a number of matters that I don't need to ask you about. But if we look at the right-hand column, thank you. The third paragraph down, you say this. Now, who is to blame for this deplorable situation, the results of which are being discussed in the seminars on hepatitis and AIDS? Frankly, we're all in this together, doctors, patients, national blood centres, commercial fractionators. We must recognise the deficiency and take drastic steps to bring coagulation factor purification into the 1980s. I do not consider that heating and irradiating blood products to remove things that shouldn't be there in the first place is anything other than a temporary measure of desperation. It would seem fairly clear from that very much on the agenda of the World Federation of Haemophilia were the risks of hepatitis and AIDS.
Yes.
Do you recall what in particular was being discussed or raised on either of those issues at that meeting?
I was using colourful language to emphasise the inherent risks of pooling blood from thousands of donors. My view, the biochemical one of let's purify what we really want out of the blood, and eventually, as I say later, let's synthesize it, which we did achieve, but not for quite a long time. Well, not for 2 years after that. What was being developed then was ways of inactivating viruses. The details of that didn't really get discussed. There was a lot of commercial secrecy around that. There was also a problem that the agents of most risk, as it turned out, hepatitis C and HIV, human immune deficiency virus, HTLV3, hadn't been isolated and characterized at that point, let alone assayed. So it was sort of feeling in the dark, and there weren't a good or reasonable animal model to look at transmission. So you're back to clinical trials of products after you'd treated them in ways that you hoped would in some way inactivate what you weren't really sure was there in the first place. So, I mean, we were really in the dark, and I was taking a kind of purist biochemical approach, which was, let's isolate the thing we want, and that will get rid of the virus, per se. So, but yeah, everyone was well aware that there was a life-threatening problem with our best treatments, and people were trying to find ways to deal with it. I suggested the way that came to me. Others were working on viral inactivation. They got lucky with that because the viruses that they had to inactivate had this property that you can actually inactivate them by rather simple methods. But it took a while to perfect those. The early shots at heat treatment weren't effective, and it didn't finally become effective until 1986. And the sort of steps on that road weren't being widely publicized. They were being developed in commercial laboratories.
What?
Are we moving on from this paper
Yes,
now?
we are.
May I just ask you about two things which you say in the paper, which have struck me just listening to you. The first is that you make a case in your paper that nothing much has happened with the technology of blood production since the early 1970s, and you're critical of that. The second is that you observed, I suspect entirely rightly, that there was quite a degree of commercial secrecy as between the various commercial firms which were attempting to inactivate viruses. One of the features of what I'm looking at is that 3 or 4 firms, the 4 major pharmaceutical producers of factor VIII perhaps in the United States, all under their own forms of commercial secrecy, so presumably not talking to each other, short of espionage, were on exactly the same lines and about the same time produced similar products. There were differences, but they're as you'd expect. So, could that have been done earlier with a bit of will?
I believe so.
Thank you.
Yes, I do believe so. The purification methods for mass separation of fractions from human plasma were developed during the Second World War by Cohn. And the so-called cold ethanol fractionation was in use as the major, and parts of that method are still in use today. But they were sort of modifications of those methods were in use for the factor VIII concentrates. Further steps were then taken very, very empirically, but a sort of mainstream biochemical approach to separating took a long time to find its way through. They had a product which they could sell, and they did. And the impetus to improve it came rather slowly, in my view. I guess I'm taking a purist view of that.
Well, it's your view that I was looking for, because
Yes.
because of the two matters which I've just raised with you, and thank you for that.
Professor Tuddenham, I just wanted to ask you about the Royal Free Centre's response to what by this stage in the early 80s is a known risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and by 1983 is knowledge of at the very least a possible, if not likely, link between factor concentrates and AIDS. Professor Lee's evidence, both to the Lindsay Tribunal and to this inquiry, was that there was no change in the treatment policies at the Royal Free in response to those risks. So throughout the first part of the 1980s until the end of 1984, when heat-treated products became available, her understanding was that the policy of treating children with NHS concentrate was continued, but other than that, it was continued commercial concentrates in the same way as before. I think that's effectively what your statement also accepts.
Yes, I'm stating that.
And we can see, if we look at RFLT 5019, please, Henry. We can see it's an application for an early application for ethics approval of research involving investigations on human subjects. It's submitted by Dr. Kernoff on the 1st of December 1983. But your name and Dr. Kernoff's is given as the head of section. I know you've seen this document very recently. There are two parts of what Dr. Kernoff was proposing to study here. The polyelectrolyte fractionated porcine factor 8, which we've already discussed, and then the heat-treated human factor 8. And he goes on to say, if we look under the heading background, he says the incidence of acute non-A, non-B after a first exposure to routine human factor 8 concentrates, either NHS or commercial, approaches 100%. Of particular concern is the high risk of chronic hepatitis following an acute attack. And then he goes on to say that the Royal Free has been offered 2 human commercial heat-treated products for clinical assessment, both of which have been granted clinical trials exemption. And he asks for approval for a piece of work, and we know from other documents that I needn't trouble you with, that approval was forthcoming. Do you know whether those trials of heat-treated products ever took place at the centre?
No.
As in you don't know?
No. Unless one can find a publication in which the result of the trial is included, I don't know.
And your interest in this, as I understand it, was the porcine element of it. Would you have been involved in any clinical trial in relation to patients using the heat-treated concentrates if it had gone ahead?
No, but I was involved with the porcine.
So if we then go, please, to BART 0000676. This is now brings us to December 1984. It's a meeting of the Haemophilia Working Party of the North East Thames Region Association of Haematologists, and we can see that Dr. Kernoff is there and you're there. If we go to the bottom of the second page, we can see there's reference to the possibility of BPL heat-treated concentrate, and then there's an agreement in the meantime if we look at Little Roman 2, that heat-treated materials should be used whenever possible, with the exception of NHS factor 9 concentrate. It said that all new patients and mild haemophiliacs with injuries requiring maintenance of high levels of factor VIII should be treated with heat-treated NHS factor concentrate or small pool factor concentrate pro tem if treatment with cryoprecipitate or DDAVP is not possible. And then if we go to the top of the next page and we look at the second paragraph, elective surgery should be delayed until the position is clearer and the efficacy of heat treatment proven. Now, as far as one can tell from the documents and Professor Lee's evidence, December 1984 was the first time that the Royal Free effectively responded by changing its approach to treatment, and it did so then in two ways: the introduction of heat-treated concentrates, and at that point, December 1984, a decision to delay elective surgery. Is that correct as far as you're aware?
Yes. Yep.
And then if we go to CGRA 0000560, please, Henry. Just wanted to ask if you're able to assist with what this letter was concerned with. This is a letter, March 1985, addressed to you. Not entirely sure. So yes, it's in relation to COAT, and you're being offered unheated COAT to cover the requirements of the Fatimid Foundation. Is this anything to do with treatment at the Royal Free, or is this to do with something else entirely?
It's not to do with treatment at the Royal Free. It's to do with treatment at a haemophilia centre in Karachi.
Okay. And then Professor Lee's further evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal and to this inquiry was that, having got to this stage in December 1984, there was then a phased introduction of heat-treated concentrates over a 3 to 6 month period. And we can see a letter at BART 40819_002, please, Henry. This is a letter 17th of January 85, so it's a month after the meeting that we just looked at. And it's from Dr. Kernoff. It's addressed to patients receiving treatment with factor VIII or 9 concentrates at the Haemophilia Centre. The heading is heat-treated concentrates, and it's telling patients that to reduce the risks of virus transmission, we've decided that all factor VIII concentrates used at the Royal Free will be heat-treated products. No change proposed currently in relation to factor 9. And then in the second paragraph, it says, for many complex reasons, including the fact that there is at present no heat-treated NHS factor VIII available, it will not be possible to change everybody to heat-treated products immediately. Not everybody will receive the same type of material. In general, patients routinely treated with commercial factor VIII will be changed to commercial heat-treated materials. Patients treated with NHS factor VIII will either be changed to heat-treated products or kept on standard NHS factor VIII for a few months longer, in the hope that small quantities of heat-treated NHS factor VIII may soon become available. In the longer term, we hope that larger amounts of heat-treated NHS factor VIII will be supplied. So it would appear to be, in part at least, a supply issue in terms of not enough heat-treated concentrates available to switch everyone immediately. Do you recall whether there was any discussion in the centre between you and Dr. Kernoff or others about what to do in response to this particular problem, now that the dangers of unheated concentrates are explicitly recognised? Was there a discussion that took place at all?
No, I don't recall that at all. Reading this, I mean, it's obvious that he was very much engaged with this issue, trying to source heat-treated, safer concentrates. Though whether they would be safer from the point of view of HIV transmission was not going to be fully apparent for some time. But we didn't talk about it. And I was very much engaged at that point with this race to pure factor 8 and its immediate sequelae, and we didn't talk about these other issues. He kept these to himself.
Okay. If we just look a couple of paragraphs down, it says, first of all, the overall objective of our policy is to give the safest possible treatment to an individual. And then it says this: home treatment patients should continue to use their current stocks until they're almost finished, as at present, then call in personally to collect new supplies. Now, the effect of that, presumably, is that patients who have unheated products capable of, it's believed and understood this time to be capable of transmitting HIV, AIDS, are going to just use up their supply rather than any step being taken to ask them to immediately change. Does that cause you concern, seeing that there?
Yes, it's obviously illogical. If there's a risk, it should be met by immediately stopping using the at-risk product. However, at that point, you've then got to replace it with something else because the risk of bleeding continues.
And given that at this point in time, whatever the arguments might have been earlier, you're talking about treatment for a relatively short period of time, a matter of months it's going to be, or in terms of supplies, weeks. Wouldn't cryoprecipitate, for example, have been, at least as a temporary measure, an obvious alternative?
It would have been, and I know that some directors took that decision, and some patients.
If we just look, please, at your statement, paragraph 25, I think. I'll just put it on screen so others can follow. It's WITN 3435002, please, Henry. And if we could go to page 16, please. At the top of the page, paragraph 25, you say this: I'm not aware of any formal decision-making structure in place at KDHC, that's the Catherine Dormandy Haemophilia Centre, during the period 1978 to 1986. If there was one, it was in the knowledge and judgment of my colleagues, especially Peter Kernoff. He was certainly as well informed as anyone about these risks through his work on non-A, non-B. So is it fair to understand from that these were essentially judgments, decisions that were being left to the decision-making process of Dr. Kernoff on his own, essentially?
Yes, that's my inference from all that happened and the documents you've brought to my attention.
And then you go on to say this: that may have had an inherent misleading bias when applied to hepatitis C as contrasted to HIV. And I just wanted to ask you what you meant by that.
Well, he would have formed a view about risk based on his experience with hepatitis C. And as he demonstrated, and as we saw earlier, all concentrates containing plasma sourced from more than 100 individuals, or certainly more than a couple of hundred individuals, by a statistical necessity, will be transmitting hepatitis C. How much safer it was in relation to HIV would only emerge when the understanding of that virus and means to test it were available. So I'm speculating, of course, about his thinking process, and it probably seemed to him likely at that time that the relative greater safety of NHS concentrate might not be that much better than the concentrates from elsewhere.
And then in paragraph 27, and just so that the what you say there can be understood, the question that you were there answering, if I can find the question.
Yes.
Well, I can find it, but I can paraphrase it. The question you were being asked, and you answer there, is about whether there were any decisions or actions taken by the centre to minimise or reduce the risk of infection. And your answer is other than only giving treatment when it was necessary to stop bleeding, none that I can recall. And then you say this, the principle was, if in doubt as to whether signs and symptoms were due to bleeding or not, treat anyway. Could you just explain what you mean by that principle?
It's a general principle in haemophilia care that if you have reason to suspect there may be bleeding, give the treatment that will stop the bleeding, and then you've taken care of that as a possible explanation for whatever symptoms you're observing. So it was, if in doubt, treat. Yeah, but it's a safety principle in caring for people who are always at risk of life or limb-threatening bleeding. But of course that comes into this difficult area of doubt when the treatment you're giving has got its own inherent risks, which is the whole subject of this inquiry.
Professor Tuddenham, I want to come on and ask you about UK HCDO and its role in response, in particular to the AIDS crisis. And although, as you've explained, your interest by this time was essentially research-based rather than much by way of clinical decision-making, you're one of the few reference centre directors who will be giving evidence. And so these are issues which it's important to ask you about. Before we look at any individual document, what, if anything, can you tell us about the way in which the UK HCDO operated and its hierarchy and the role of the reference centre directors in that period 78 to 85?
We were a group of colleagues who were gathered together under the common objective of organising and improving the management of haemophilia, which was and is still a very advanced in comparison to what was available in most other, even developed countries. There's other sort of shining examples, like some of the Scandinavian countries, but we prided ourselves on being the group that was best able to monitor, manage and progress how we managed this group of severe congenital disorders. So we were gathered together to optimise the monitoring of standard of care, gathering data, making representation to Department of Health for ways to improve. And as problems arose, as they indeed did, in the way we're here to discuss, they were dealt with. It wasn't a very highly hierarchical. We were a group of colleagues who respected each other. People would volunteer to take on the roles within the organisation as they do today, and it wasn't often that there was a contentious issue that would give rise to a vote. I mean, agreements were reached over a course of discussion, and people used best efforts to come up with policies over the sort of new problems as and when they arose. So it it wasn't a sort of fierce debating society. It was a collegial effort to gather our thoughts and propose solutions as best we could in, as it was then, a rapidly evolving and difficult, very difficult situation.
And the reference centre directors certainly seem to meet annually. Was that the normal pattern, or was it more frequent than that? There are certainly special meetings we see.
I don't remember. I think you're right, it was less. We were meeting quite more frequently as the need arose. The meetings took place quite often at the Royal Free, which was convenient for me, and sometimes in Oxford. The agenda was devised by whoever the lead clinician of the day was, and people spoke as they felt moved according to their experience. We have a system of having committees that would address particular topics, as I think I've answered questions later on, and they would report back after taking further advice from experts, and the reports were considered. The idea was that if there was a particular project, it would be dealt with in a time-limited way. And I would say that given a kind of national emergency, really, which this situation gave rise to, we did the best we could, but the steps that were going to change the situation, which was developing the assays that enable you to identify exactly where the infection is and who's got it and what to do about it, and the improvement in the virus inactivation and better quality product, were not in our hands. What we had an opportunity to do was choose between different products and have policies, but we were left in this between a rock and a hard place, between the fact you have to treat the immediate emergency of a bleed, but is the product you've got a safe, effective means of doing that? So I'd say the overall influence that the UK HCDO could have on this, as being to some extent just a gathering of colleagues in a talking shop, is not, unless a very, very firm line were taken to pursue a particular policy, we didn't tend to impose views that the necessary would be just kind of opinions, really, educated opinions, on the rest of our colleagues, because we didn't have the executive power to do that. We could make representation to government, we could make recommendation to our colleagues, but we weren't in a position of being able to issue orders and diktats.
Would the task of the reference centre directors in responding to this national emergency have been assisted by guidance or advice or intervention at a national level by the Chief Medical Officer, for example, or the Department of Health?
I can only say that to my recall they weren't. Well, committees began to be got together of virus experts, but the UK didn't have a sort of, well, we had the fractionators at Oxford, but they weren't major players, and they weren't running large research groups, and they weren't, to my knowledge, collaborating closely with virologists, biochemists. I mean, it was all a bit semi-amateur, slightly ad hoc. That's a harsh statement. I mean, looking back, what were they doing? They were doing their best to produce good quality products for us to use. They were clearly underfunded in the ambition to be self-sufficient. Could have used a lot more funding and a lot more push to do that, although it had been declared an ambition. It didn't come to pass, ever. And so we were left trying to do the best with the limited resources that we had. As you can see, and it was somewhat frustrating, as Peter Kernoff's letters illustrate. And we were left trying to make the best of what was certainly in retrospect, and even apparently at the time, a pretty difficult and unsatisfactory situation in regard to supply, resources, assays. All those things eventually emerged, but one could only wish that they would have emerged sooner with the benefit of the hindsight we now have. At the time, we were doing the best we could, I think, is all I could really say about that.
Okay, I'll look at some documents with you, but it's just gone 1 o'clock, sir, so perhaps I can pick that up too.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock, if you please. And then we come back.